There's a moment in the 2007 film American Gangster that millions of people still talk about. Denzel Washington, playing Frank Lucas, sitting in a restaurant with Harlem kingpin Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy suddenly collapses. Frank catches him, cradles him in his arms, and as Bumpy takes his final breath, the torch gets passed. It's powerful, it's emotional, it feels legendary. But according to the woman who was actually there, it never happened. Mayme Johnson, Bumpy's wife of over 20 years, and said, Frank Lucas was not at the wake. He was not at the funeral. I don't know where he was, but he was not there. She was 93 years old when she said that, sharp as a knife, furious, and determined to expose every lie Frank Lucas had told about her husband before she died. And tonight, on Bumpy Johnson, Decoding Dark History, we're telling that story. Not the Hollywood version, not the gangster mythology, but the story of how Frank Lucas, the man who claimed to be Bumpy Johnson's right-hand man, his driver, his protege, was actually, in Mayme's words, nothing but a flunky. This is the story of a widow who waited 40 years to tell the truth, who watched Hollywood turn a liar into a legend, who finally wrote a book at age 93 called Harlem Godfather, the rap on my husband Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, just to make sure the world knew, because according to Mayme Johnson, Frank Lucas is a damn liar. Before we talk about Frank Lucas, before we talk about American Gangster, you need to understand who Mayme Johnson was. Because this wasn't just some woman with an opinion. This was the woman who lived with Bumpy Johnson for over 20 years, the woman who saw Harlem from the inside, the woman who knew how power really moved in those streets. This was the woman who hosted dinners for Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Lena Horne, Joe Louis, Sidney Poitier. Politicians, musicians, businessmen, power brokers, all came through her living room. She knew who belonged, and she knew who didn't. So when Frank Lucas started telling the world he was Bumpy Johnson's right-hand man, that he lived with them, that Bumpy died in his arms, Mayme didn't just feel insulted, she felt betrayed, because in her mind, Frank wasn't just lying about himself, he was lying about Bumpy, and that she couldn't tolerate. It started in 2007. American Gangster was released in November, directed by Ridley Scott, starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas, Russell Crowe as Detective Richie Roberts. The movie told Frank's story, how he said he was mentored by Bumpy Johnson, how he claimed he built a heroin empire by importing drugs directly from Thailand, how he became one of the most powerful drug dealers in American history. The movie made $266 million worldwide. Critics loved it. Audiences loved it. But Mayme Johnson, living in a nursing home in Philadelphia, 93 years old, watched the trailers on BT and started screaming at the television. She later wrote, "When I heard that the Harlem dope dealer, Frank Lucas, wrote a magazine article a few years back claiming that he was Bumpy's right-hand man and that Bumpy died in his arms, I was upset. He lied." Then she saw the BET special, the one where Frank claimed he lived with Bumpy and Mayme for 6 months, the one where he pointed to a brownstone on 121st Street and said, "Right there. My boss lived right there." Mayme said, "My hands shook with rage. We lived on 2nd West 120th Street, not 121st. Frank can't even get the address right." The people with her wanted to turn off the TV. They were worried she'd have a heart attack from the stress. But Mayme refused. She watched the whole thing, every lie, every fabrication, every moment where Frank Lucas made himself the hero of a story that was not his. And when it was over, she made a decision. She was going to write a book. She was going to expose every lie Frank had told. And she was going to make sure that before she died, the world knew the truth about Bumpy Johnson and the truth about Frank Lucas. Let's start with Mayme's most devastating quote, the one that cuts through 40 years of Frank Lucas mythology like a knife. She said, "Frank wasn't nothing but a flunky, and one that Bumpy never did really trust. No, Frank was a minor associate. No, Frank was someone Bumpy knew, a flunky, and not just any flunky, a flunky Bumpy never trusted. Frank Lucas claimed he was Bumpy's driver for 15 years, that he was by his side constantly, that he was the right-hand man who knew everything. Mayme called it bullshit. She was clear. Frank Lucas was never his driver, never. Bumpy drove for himself. She said the only people who used to drive Bumpy, and that was back in the 1930s, were Freddie Parson and JJ. She said she thought Frank drove him only 2 times. And on one of those times, somebody threw a brick through the car window. 2 times. Not 15 years. 2 times. And during one of those 2 times, someone threw a brick at the car. That suggests that even the few times Frank was around, things went wrong. Mayme continued. The real relationship between Bumpy and Frank was basically that Frank was just a person who would hold Bumpy's coat and follow him around. He was very distant, very poor, and he had no real relationship with Bumpy. Hold his coat, follow him around. That's it. That's the extent of Frank Lucas's relationship with Bumpy Johnson. According to the woman who lived with Bumpy for 20 years, Frank was not the protege. He was not the right-hand man. He was not the heir to the throne. He was the guy who held the coat. Frank Lucas claimed he lived with Bumpy and Mayme for 6 months. He said it in interviews, in the movie, on television, again and again, that Bumpy took him in, gave him a place to stay, treated him like family. Mayme's response was blunt. Frank Lucas never spent one night in my house. And she added, we did not live on 121st Street. We lived on 120th Street. She didn't say, well, Frank stayed with us briefly. She didn't say, Frank visited occasionally. She said, he never spent one night. Mayme said, he was never invited to the house. And we entertained a lot and had dinners and things for different people. Think about that. Bumpy and Mayme hosted dinners for Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Lena Horne, Joe Louis, Sidney Poitier. The biggest names in Harlem came through their living room. Frank Lucas? Never invited. Not once. Not for dinner. Not for a meeting. Not for anything. Why? Because Mayme said Bumpy didn't trust him. Because Bumpy saw Frank for what he was, a liar. Mayme recalled Bumpy used to say, you can trust a thief quicker than a liar, because a thief steals money because he needs money, but a liar lies for the hell of it. And according to Mayme, Frank Lucas lied for the hell of it, and Bumpy knew it. This is the lie that made Mayme the angriest, the lie that turned Frank Lucas into a legend. Frank claimed he was with Bumpy when he died, that Bumpy collapsed in his arms, that Bumpy's last words were instructions to Frank about how to run things. It's the emotional climax of American Gangster, the moment when the torch gets passed from one generation to the next, and it never happened. Mayme said, Frank Lucas was not at the wake. He was not at the funeral. I do not know where he was, but he was not there. Here's what actually happened on July the 7th, 1968. That night, Bumpy and Mayme were home together. They watched the Lawrence Welk show. Then Bumpy decided to go out with his childhood friend, Junie Bird. They went to Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. Bumpy ordered his usual chicken, grits, coffee. He was eating when he suffered a massive heart attack. He collapsed. Another childhood friend, Finley Hoskins, was there. Junie Bird cradled Bumpy in his arms. Someone called an ambulance. Junie ran to get Mayme. She rushed to the scene. Bumpy was taken to Harlem Hospital. He died on the way. Frank Lucas was nowhere to be found. Mayme said, it was Junie Bird that came and got me. I was in the house and he had just left me, and we had watched the Lawrence Welk show that night. He decided to ride out with Junie Bird, and that is where he died. Well, that's where he had his heart attack. He died on his way to Harlem Hospital, not in Frank's arms, not after giving Frank instructions, not passing the torch. Bumpy died with his childhood friends by his side. His wife arrived moments later. Frank Lucas was not there. Mayme added, from what I read, Frank was out of the country in 1968, not in New York, not at the restaurant, not at the hospital, not at the wake, not at the funeral. And yet, Frank told the world he was there, that Bumpy died in his arms, that he was the last person Bumpy spoke to. Why? Mayme said. He figured everyone who was around Bumpy at the time is now dead. Junie Bird is gone, Nat Pettigrew is gone, Sonny Chance is gone, and Finley Hoskins is gone. She continued. Frank would never have said any garbage like that if one of them were alive, because he would know they would come after him. Frank waited until all the witnesses were dead. Then he started lying. And then Mayme said something chilling. I bet he thought I was gone too. But I'm not. I'm 93 and I do not have Alzheimer's or dementia. Frank Lucas is a damn liar and I want the world to know it. So the question becomes, why? Why did Frank Lucas lie about everything? Why claim he was Bumpy's right-hand man when he was barely in the room? Why claim he lived with Bumpy when he was never invited to the house? Why claim Bumpy died in his arms when he wasn't even in the country? Because Frank needed Bumpy's name to legitimize his own story. Here's the truth. Frank Lucas really did build a heroin empire in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He really did import drugs directly from Thailand. He really did make millions of dollars. He really was a powerful drug dealer. But that story, a guy from North Carolina moves to New York and sells drugs, that's not legendary. That's not a movie. That's not American Gangster. But if Frank could tie himself to Bumpy Johnson, if he could convince people he was mentored by the Godfather of Harlem, if he could make Hollywood believe he inherited Bumpy's empire, then suddenly his story becomes epic. So Frank lied, repeatedly, systematically, about everything. He lied about being Bumpy's driver. He lied about living with Bumpy. He lied about being at important meetings. He lied about being Bumpy's right-hand man. He lied about Bumpy dying in his arms. He lied about everything. And he did it because he thought everyone who could contradict him was dead. When Mayme decided to write a book, she was 93 years old, living in a nursing home, in declining health. Most people would have let it go. Most people would have said, "I'm too old for this fight." Not Mayme. She enlisted author Karen E. Canonis Miller, who had known Bumpy as a child growing up in Harlem, to help her write Harlem Godfather, the rap on my husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. But publishing houses wanted to wait until late 2008 or 2009 to release it. That was too long. Mayme didn't know if she'd live that long, so Karen self-published through her own company, Ocean Publishing. Karen later said, Mayme Johnson wanted to dance the Charleston at the book launch party. And Karen wanted to make sure that happened. But self-publishing costs money. Money Mayme didn't have. So Karen set up a website, explained the situation, and asked people to pre-order the book. $10 for a signed copy of a book that hadn't even been written yet. 300 people sent money. Most of them had never met Mayme, never met Karen, but they believed in the mission. They wanted the truth out. African-American radio hosts promoted the book. Bloggers spread the word. Journalists talked about it. Mayme Johnson is writing a book. Mayme Johnson is telling the truth about Frank Lucas. Support her. And people did. Mayme told anyone who would listen, Frank is a liar. He was never more than a flunky to my husband. He's only saying those lies because he thought everyone who'd remember was dead. Guess what, Frank? I'm very alive, and I'm calling you out. Harlem Godfather was published in February 2008. It became the first and only complete biography of Bumpy Johnson, written by the woman who knew him better than anyone, the woman who lived with him for 20 years, the woman who stood beside him through prison sentences, gang wars, and everything in between. And the book didn't just expose Frank's lies. It told Bumpy's real story, how he came to Harlem from South Carolina as a teenager, how he fought his way up from nothing, how he survived gang wars with Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano, how he became the most powerful man in Harlem. It detailed his relationships with Harlem's elite, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Lena Horne, Joe Louis, Sidney Poitier. These weren't just names. These were his friends. People who came to his house, people who trusted him. The book explained Bumpy's philosophy, that he wasn't just a criminal, he was a protector, that he kept the Italian mob from completely taking over Harlem, that he negotiated peace between street gangs, that he paid rents for families who couldn't afford it, that he organized Thanksgiving turkey giveaways for the poor. Bumpy was complicated, violent, intelligent, generous, ruthless, a man of contradictions, but according to Mayme, he was one thing above all else, loyal to Harlem. And Frank Lucas, who flooded Harlem with heroin so pure it killed hundreds of people, was the opposite of everything Bumpy stood for. The timeline alone proves Frank lied. Frank claimed he was Bumpy's driver and right-hand man for 15 years, but Bumpy went to prison in 1952. He was sent to Alcatraz. He didn't get out until 1963. That's 11 years. Bumpy died in 1968, 5 years later. So unless Frank was somehow driving Bumpy around while Bumpy was locked in Alcatraz, the 15-year claim is impossible. Even if we're generous and say Frank met Bumpy in 1950 and Bumpy died in 1968. That's 18 years total minus 11 years in prison. That leaves 7, not 15. 7. And according to Mayme, Frank wasn't even around during those 7 years either. He was peripheral, someone who held coats, someone who followed Bumpy from a distance. She said, Bumpy had friends like Nat Pettigrew, Junie Bird, Sonny Chance, the Capuzzo brothers, and all them people like that. Frank Lucas did not fit into that circle. The real people Bumpy trusted were Junie Bird, Nat Pettigrew, and Finley Hoskins. They were the ones at Wells' restaurant when he died. They were the ones at the wake. They were the ones at the funeral. Frank Lucas was nowhere to be found. Mayme Johnson died on May 1st, 2009. She was 94 years old. She died knowing she'd accomplished her mission. The book was published. The truth was out. Frank Lucas had been exposed as a liar. 2 days before she died, she received word that a film company was negotiating to purchase the rights to Harlem Godfather. Her friend Henry Perkins said she was tickled pink to tell people she was an author at age 93. Boy, it really made her proud to finally get that book done. Mayme's last public statement about Frank Lucas came in a 2007 interview. She said, "That's why I'm writing this book after all this time. Hollywood should be ashamed of yourself. And if it was Frank Lucas that told Hollywood those lies, Mr. Lucas, you should hang your head." Frank Lucas died on May 30th, 2019 at age 88. He never publicly admitted he lied about Bumpy Johnson. He never apologized to Mayme. He never corrected the record. He took his lies to the grave. But Mayme had already won, because the truth, documented in her book, preserved in her interviews, and spread by the people who believed her, outlived Frank's lies. And you might be wondering, why does this matter? Frank Lucas is dead. Mayme Johnson is dead. Bumpy Johnson died over 50 years ago. Why does it matter that Frank lied? It matters because legends are built on lies. And when lies become legends, they erase the truth. Frank Lucas's lies didn't just inflate his own importance. They diminished Bumpy Johnson's legacy. They made Bumpy look weak, like a man who mentored the person who would destroy his community, like a man who died and was immediately forgotten, replaced by his protege. That's not what happened. Bumpy died with his childhood friends by his side. He died loved and respected by Harlem. He died knowing he had protected his neighborhood for 30 years. Frank Lucas did not inherit Bumpy's empire. Frank built his own empire, an empire of heroin that poisoned the same streets Bumpy had protected. And when Frank tried to claim he learned everything from Bumpy, when he tried to make himself the heir to the godfather of Harlem, he was spitting on Bumpy's grave. But Mayme Johnson, 93 years old, living in a nursing home, with nothing to gain except the truth, made sure that didn't stand. She wrote a book. She gave interviews. She called Frank Lucas a damn liar on national television. And she won. Because 40 years after Bumpy's death, the truth finally came out. Frank Lucas was never Bumpy's right-hand man. He was never Bumpy's driver. He never lived with Bumpy. He was never at important meetings. Bumpy never died in his arms. Frank Lucas was, in Mayme's words, nothing but a flunky. And now, the world finally knows it.